This is the story of Vancouver, a city that decided to stop fighting nature and start making room for it, and what happened when it did surprised everyone, including the scientists running the project. Vancouver, Canada has 14 million square meters of parks, boulevards, and golf courses, and for most of its modern history, the city kept all of it mowed, manicured, and perfectly tidy. 6 million square meters of that was just lawn, which sounds nice until you realize that a lawn, from a wildlife perspective, is essentially a green desert. In 2015, a landscape architect named Jack Tupper started asking a question that city governments rarely ask. What if we just stopped mowing some of it? Not all of it, not even most of it. Just patches, specific, carefully chosen patches of boulevard and parkland left to grow into something wilder. By 2020, that question had become an official city program called the Pollinator Meadows Initiative, part of a growing movement that includes efforts like No Mow May across North America. What it produced was something far beyond what anyone expected, and it is now rewriting how cities across Canada think about the ground beneath their feet. To understand why Vancouver's experiment matters, you have to understand what urban green space usually looks like from a wildlife's point of view. A mowed lawn supports around 30 species of wild bees and hoverflies, according to researchers at the University of British Columbia who studied the city's parks. That sounds like a reasonable number until you consider what bees actually need: diverse flowering plants, undisturbed soil for ground nesting, leaf litter for shelter in winter, and a connected corridor of habitat they can travel through without hitting a concrete dead end every few blocks. Manicured parks offer almost none of that. They are green, they are pleasant for humans, and they are close to biologically silent for the insects and birds that depend on native plant diversity to survive. Vancouver's own park board documented the consequences. A broad range of animals that once called the city home had been locally wiped out over the 20th century. Deer, elk, bears, red fox, bobcats, red-legged frogs, spotted skunks, gray wolves. At least 20 species remained at risk within city boundaries, including the western painted turtle, the Johnson's hair-streaked butterfly, and the western bumblebee. Marine forage fish in English Bay had collapsed to just 5% of their historical population. The city was surrounded by stunning wilderness, full of residents who loved nature, and yet the urban environment itself had become almost entirely inhospitable to the things that make an ecosystem function. Tupper's research, which began as a master's thesis at UBC in 2015, started from a deceptively simple premise. Native plant diversity drives insect diversity. Insect diversity drives bird and small mammal populations, and the whole chain starts with what you plant, or in this case, what you stop cutting down. Tupper joined the Vancouver Parks Board full-time in 2020, and that same year the city launched what became known as the Pollinator Meadows program, a city-led initiative to convert portions of Vancouver's maintained parkland and road boulevards into wilder, self-sustaining ecosystems. The mechanics of it were almost disarmingly low-tech. Stop mowing specific patches, plant mixes of native wildflowers and grasses where possible. Keep clean, mowed perimeters around each meadow so the public understands the wildness is intentional rather than neglect. Put up small signs, and then, critically, get out of the way. Choosing locations required real care. Each meadow needed to be a minimum of 3.5 meters wide to feel purposeful rather than accidental. Seed mixes had to be tailored to each site's conditions, avoiding aggressive native species like yarrow that could crowd out other plants and damage adjacent sports fields. Some sites became full wildflower meadows, dense with black-eyed Susans, purple echinacea, and native grasses. Others were simply lawns allowed to grow, which turned out to have measurable ecological value on their own. One unexpected benefit showed up in the data almost immediately. The meadows held significantly more moisture in the soil than mowed grass, which kept ground temperatures cooler through Vancouver's dry summers, helping to reduce the urban heat island effect. Tupper noted that this was never part of the original design goal. It just happened once the mowing stopped. Jens Ulrich, a UBC PhD student who partnered with the city to study the meadows between 2021 and 2024, started measuring what was actually living in them. His findings, published in Ecology Letters, were striking. A normal maintained park supported around 30 species of wild bees and hoverflies. A park containing one of the new meadows supported around 60 species, double the number, including rare species like the Vancouver bumblebee, Nevada bumblebee, and Milwaukee minor bee, and that higher count held stable across the second and third years of the study. 60 species of wild bees and hoverflies in the middle of a Canadian city, in patches of boulevard that used to be mowed grass. And that number stayed consistent year after year once the meadow was established. Bees and hoverflies were only the beginning of what started showing up. Stanley Park, Vancouver's 400-hectare urban forest on the edge of downtown, had quietly been accumulating wildlife for years alongside the Meadows program, and the two stories are deeply connected. The park is now home to one of the largest urban great blue heron colonies in North America, with birds nesting at the same location since at least 2001. Over the course of a year, as many as 230 species of birds pass through or reside in the park's forests, wetlands, and shorelines. Beavers returned to Stanley Park's Beaver Lake in 2008, after more than 60 years of absence, and by the time the Meadows program launched, up to 5 beavers had been documented there at once, doing what beavers do, building dams, backing up water, and accidentally creating wetland habitat for everything downstream. Hinge Park, created at the western edge of Olympic Village, became a gathering point that nobody planned for. The narrow park, built around a creek emptying toward Habitat Island, began attracting beavers, coyotes, river otters, raccoons, and waterfowl within a few years of opening. Nick Page, the resident biologist for the Vancouver Park Board, described it plainly in 2016. You could tell people you live in Olympic Village and have beavers in your backyard. Up to 300 coyotes now live across Vancouver's neighborhoods, according to the Stanley Park Ecology Society, which runs the city's urban coyote program. A gray whale entered English Bay and First Narrows in 2015, drawn in by recovering populations of small arthropods and crustaceans in the water. The entire coastline of Stanley Park earned designation as an important bird area of Canada from BirdLife International, recognizing globally significant populations of Barrow's goldeneye and western grebe. None of this happened because the city imported animals or engineered specific outcomes. What the city did was remove the pressure, plant the right plants, stop mowing the right patches, and connect spaces that had previously been isolated. The wildlife filled in the rest on its own schedule. What Tupper noticed when he laid Vancouver's meadow locations over city planning maps was something nobody had explicitly designed. The meadows, placed street by street across the city over 4 years, were forming the rough outline of ecological corridors, connected pathways of habitat that allow insects, birds, and small mammals to travel between larger green spaces without crossing unbroken stretches of concrete. Both the City of Vancouver and the Parks Board have long-term planning documents that envision exactly this kind of ecological network woven through the urban fabric. The Meadows, which started as a research project about bee diversity, are becoming the first physical pieces of that network. Tupper put it directly, he believes they will stay and that they will become the foundation of Vancouver's future ecological corridors. 6 million square meters of lawn remains in Vancouver. 7% of it has been converted so far. The city's stated goal is to keep increasing that percentage as capacity and resources allow. The program has attracted attention from other Canadian cities, and the model, which requires no exotic technology and no significant capital investment beyond changing a maintenance schedule, is straightforwardly replicable. You need native seed mixes, some research on local species needs, the willingness to leave certain places alone, and clear signage so residents understand why their boulevard looks different from the one next door. What Vancouver discovered is that cities are not the enemies of nature they are sometimes assumed to be. A city willing to make space, even small, intentional, carefully managed space, can become part of the solution rather than the obstacle. Vancouver's story is not a story about a city that saved nature. It is a story about a city that gave nature a foothold and watched what nature did with it. Wild bee and hoverfly species doubled in parks where meadows were planted. Beavers returned to lakes they had abandoned for 6 decades. Heron colonies grew. Coyotes established territories. A gray whale came into the bay. None of that required a scientific breakthrough or a billion-dollar infrastructure project. It required stopping mowing certain patches of grass and planting the right seeds. There are cities all over North America sitting on millions of square meters of maintained lawn, spending significant money keeping it uniformly short, uniformly green, and uniformly silent. Vancouver's experiment suggests that the gap between a biological desert and a functioning urban ecosystem is sometimes just a decision about what to do with the mower. Nature, as it turns out, does not need much of an invitation. It needs a patch of ground, a few native plants, and a city willing to put the mower away and see what shows up. And in Vancouver, quite a lot showed up. If you want to dig deeper into this one, look up Vancouver's Pollinator Meadows program and the research by Jens Ulrich published through UBC. The biodiversity data alone is worth reading. This channel covers the stories of nature coming back, in places people least expect it, backed by real research and real numbers. New video every week. If that is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps the channel grow. Leave a comment and tell me the most surprising place you have seen wildlife turn up in a city. I read every single one. See you next week.